All right, welcome everybody. This is the work session of the City Council of the City of Cottonwood, Arizona, to be held February 9th, 2021 at 6 p.m. at the Cottonwood Community Clubhouse. And wanted to ask our folks that are joining us via Zoom or a GoToMeeting virtually this evening, if you could please go ahead and mute yourselves unless you're speaking. Obviously, that'll help keep the noise level down. And I hope all of you out there can hear us okay. So the other thing, I see we have some folks in the audience tonight. This is just a work session this evening, so there's two items for discussion. There will be no action this evening, but we're discussing discussion direction regarding bonding for the Public Safety Personnel Retirement System unfunded liability, and we're discussing departmental accomplishments for fiscal year 2021. So this evening, there's no call to the public. Just wanted to make you aware in case, I don't want to waste your time but if you're interested, by all means, please stick around and we'll be sure to entertain you to the best of our ability. All right, so first up is roll call. If we could please have our deputy clerk take the roll.
Councilmember Wilden.
Here.
Councilmember Henry.
Here.
Councilmember Matthews.
Here.
Councilmember Naren.
Here.
Councilmember Kurat.
Here.
Vice Mayor Hulse.
Here.
Mayor Alinsky.
Here, thank you. All right, first item is discussion and direction regarding bonding for the Public Safety Personnel Retirement System unfunded liability.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. I'm Kirsten Lennon, the Financial Services Director for the City of Cottonwood, and tonight we have Grant Hamill and his crew from Stiefel, and then we have Mike Townsend from the PSPRS. He's the Executive Director, and they're going to talk to you about our unfunded liability, about PSPRS, and give you some good information on bonding.
Okay, very good. Thank you for that introduction, Kirsten. Mayor Alinsky, members of the council, my name is Grant Hamill. As Kirsten said, I'm a managing director with the firm of Stiefel Nicholas, located here in Phoenix. And it is my pleasure to join you this evening to discuss the topic of pension liability management, and specifically the city's participation in the state's Public Safety Personnel Retirement System, or PSPRS. I have personally had the pleasure and honor to assist the City of Cottonwood with its various capital improvement financings for over 25 years. And it's just a place that I love to visit, and would love being before you this evening, but because of the circumstances we find ourselves in, we're joining you virtually this evening. And it's actually a platform that we have found to really be fairly effective in sharing the type of information we have for you this evening. Before I introduce a few of my Stiefel colleagues to you that will participate in our presentation this evening, I would like to introduce the council to Mike Townsend. And Mike is the director of PSPRS, as many of you know. Mike is a CPA, and before joining PSPRS in November of 2019, he served as the deputy county manager for Coconino County for many years, and also the interim county manager from 2011 to 2013. And while Mike was at Coconino County, he had extensive interest and experience dealing with PSPRS, as well as the Arizona State Retirement System. And since Mike became director of PSPRS in late 2019, he has made significant improvements in the operation and management of the pension system that he will be sharing with you this evening. And before I turn the discussion over to Mike and his presentation, I would like to just take a minute and introduce the council to a couple of my colleagues here at Stiefel that's going to be joining us for our presentation this evening. First of all, I'd like to introduce you to my Phoenix-based colleague, Jack Leeper, who will be helping us with our presentation, and also a couple of my colleagues from our Chicago office. I'm sure they would like to be out here right now with the weather they're experiencing back there. Omar Dagestani and also Claude Lockhart. Omar and Claude have extensive experience managing pension obligation bond financings, not only in the Midwest, but across the country as well. And we here in Arizona have heavily relied on their expertise in advising our Arizona clients on ways that they can effectively manage their pension liabilities. So with that, I would like to turn the discussion over to Mike Townsend. Mike?
Thank you, Grant. Thank you, Mayor and Council, for having me. I can share my screen to go through the presentation if I get, go. Okay. Is that working for everybody there in the room?
Yes, sir. We can see that. Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, thank you, Grant, for that introduction. As Grant said, I'm from Northern Arizona, so I know the area very well. I'm actually a native of Flagstaff, grew up there. So this is great to be participating with you tonight. One of the things that I've been doing, I've gone through these presentations multiple times with the Stiefel team and talking to other employers around the state, and really trying to walk through and kind of give an education first about the pension systems, what we're looking at, what the terms mean, try to get everyone on the same page so there's a level of understanding as this council looks for options and considers taking action. So I really want to acknowledge you taking the steps of trying to ask questions and educate yourselves and really get an understanding of what the issue is and how to address it. This first slide is looking at Arizona pension plans across the state. The first one is the largest, the Arizona State Retirement System. Currently has about 600,000 active, retired, and inactive members. And essentially, this is the government pension for all qualified government employees that are not in one of the other pensions listed below. When you go down, the next one, there's the Public Safety Retirement System. And then the next two that are in bold, the correction officers and elected officials, are actually all part of PSPRS, managed by my agency. And then Phoenix and Tucson also have plans for their civilian employees, but in Phoenix and Tucson, fire and police are also a part of PSPRS. So just to kind of give you an overview of what we have around the state. As I said, education on this is really important, but also an understanding of kind of how we got to where we are today. I can empathize with what all of you are dealing with, trying to understand this. This is something I was frustrated with at Coconino County, was trying to find information and get an understanding of really what caused the problem, what needed to be fixed. And that's really kind of my motivation for coming to PSPRS, is to help provide that understanding, education, and work on communication with all the employers across the state. So how did we get here? The largest impact looking back, in my opinion, was the PBI, the permanent benefit increase. I think the objective of putting the PBI in place was well-intentioned. However, the way it rolled out and the way it actually worked over time definitely had some unintended consequences. So the basics of the PBI was excess returns would be used to give cost of living increases for retirees. And so the plan was to take 50% of investment returns above 9%. The major issue with that was we would take half of the excess earnings above 9% in a good year, but when the returns were below the assumed rate of return, all of those losses or actuarial losses would stay in the plan. So 100% of the losses stayed, but the excess returns were pulled out. And so half of those funds were taken, moved to a different plan or to a different fund, and those were used to get the cost of living increases. So in essence, what happened is, on one hand, we would take part of the assets out of the trust and then increase the liabilities by giving those cost of living increases. So we were increasing liabilities and reducing assets at the same time. So there was kind of a double impact. Also, there was a disproportionate impact across the state. I think this had a larger impact on some of the rural areas. Usually the metropolitan areas would have higher levels of of pay for their employees. And so when the increases were given for the PBI, an amount was calculated of what was available across the state. And then the same dollar amount was given to all the retirees that were eligible. It wasn't just a percentage increase. So essentially what happened was those increase in the liabilities were a larger percentage of the pay for some of the smaller employers. So there was more of a liability impact on how that was growing over time through the PBI. The other consequence of this, the way it worked, was the basic assumption that the actuaries do when they go through evaluation is they're going to assume that the investments are going to return the assumed rate of return every year into the future. And so the actuaries were making an assumption that there would be no future PBIs. Once the current funds were used up, no other PBI funds would be set aside because there would be no excess returns. What actually happened was for 28 consecutive years, PBI increases were given, even in years where there were recessions, because there was such a large pool of funds that had been set aside from the excess returns. So the actuarial assumptions didn't really reflect what that impact was over the long term. And then also, once there was an understanding of how this was playing out with increasing the liabilities, there were changes made to the investment portfolio to reduce the volatility of the investments, which resulted in some reduced returns as that played out over time. So knowing kind of what happened, so what changed? And a lot of these came about during pension reform over the past several years. The legislature put Prop 124 and 125 on the ballot, and the voters approved eliminating the PBI. And in its place, they replaced it with a new COLA that's capped at 2%. And it's a different formula now. So that 2% is something now that's much more consistent, and it's something that provides more certainty and is included in the actuarial valuation. So we're accounting for projecting what those increases are going to be into the future. Also, there's been changes to the actuarial assumptions. The Board of Trustees have made changes over this last year to eliminate what we refer to as negative amortization. There used to be such long amortization periods of unfunded liabilities that it was similar. Essentially, it was like making payments on your credit card, but not even paying the full interest. So the principal would continue to grow. And that's what was happening with a lot of the unfunded liabilities. It was just so far out that it was not being paid down. And then the investment allocations. We've made changes to the staff. We have a lot of new staff. We have new trustees on the investment committee and have made revisions to that asset allocation policy on how we're managing the investments. With the president, some more changes that have been taking place. These are more internal to the agency. Since I started in December of 2019, we had some internal control deficiencies that came to light as a result of the audit. And so one of the first things we undertook when I started with the agency, we implemented a new general ledger system that was up and running July 1st. So for the current year, we are on a new system. We did an extensive review process of cash and contribution processing to make sure things are being accounted for correctly. We hired new auditors. We brought in Clifton Larson Allen. They are a national firm and they specialize in public pension auditing. So we have some real expertise there. Also, in terms of management within the organization, as I said, I started in December of 2019. A few months after that, I brought in my deputy administrator. I hired Michael Smerick from the Department of Administration. Mike, for many years, was the deputy state comptroller for the state of Arizona. He hired a chief financial officer from Access, John Mormon, who had I believe about 20 years of experience running Access. We have a new controller, new internal auditor. In addition to hiring Mike Smerick, who was the deputy state comptroller, a few months after that, we were actually approached and had an application for one of our positions in accounting. We ended up hiring the retired state comptroller to join us too. So we have brought in a lot of professionalism and state experience to help make sure that we're accounting for things correctly and doing what we can to help support the employers and make sure everybody understands what's going on. As a matter of fact, Clark Partridge, who used to be the state comptroller, is the one who put this presentation together for me tonight. And he is one that's a resource to the city of Cottonwood. He's in his position. He is there to provide guidance and education and help with information for actuarial and accounting information. The actuaries have just finished the second valuation for us, so they're fairly new actuaries, and they also created the modelers for us that allow employers to go through and look at different scenarios, run different options to look at what changes they could make and how to manage those liabilities. We've made changes in the IT area, security upgrades, the investment opportunities, asset allocation. I spoke a little bit about that with the changes in the staff, but also over this last year with the pandemic, the economic situation has also been pretty volatile. And our staff have actually put us in a unique position. Public pensions are a unique institutional investor. With the contributions that come in regularly through the payroll, we're actually cash flow positive. And so that puts us in a position that we're not required to liquidate investments in a down market to provide cash to make the pension payroll. And because we're not in that position, we can actually take advantage of other institutional investors that are in a position to need to liquidate some of their investments in a down market. So we've positioned ourselves very well over the last year, taking advantage of that volatility in the markets. The board adopted those actuarial changes, eliminating negative amortization. And we've also re-engaged what's referred to as the advisory committee. That is made up of stakeholders, both employers and member groups, specifically to the city of Cottonwood. Tom Belshey with the League of Cities and Towns sits on that advisory committee, as well as Craig Sullivan with the County Supervisors Association. So very well represented by employers. So now I'd like to go and start talking through the pensions to make sure that everyone understands, get kind of a baseline so we're all using the terms the same way. The PSPRS pension system is what's referred to as defined benefit. And so that it defines what the benefit is going to be at the end of someone's career when they retire. And so those formulas are set in statute. We cannot change the formulas. So somebody is going to get an actual benefit. It's not something that might happen. And here's an example of a 25-year employee in Tier 1. There will be a percentage based on the years of service times the average compensation, and there will be an annual pension that's paid. That is set in statute. The challenge that we have with defined benefits is we're trying to estimate what's going to happen in the future. So we're estimating what that future liability is going to be based on the actuarial assumptions. And so what our actuaries do is based on those assumptions, they're estimating, well, how long is somebody going to stay in their job? What is their final pay going to be in that job? How long are they going to draw that retirement? Will they have a spouse that is eligible for survivor benefit? How long might that person be drawing a pension? So there's a lot of estimates that go in here that are constantly being revised and estimating that liability. And that's where the challenge comes in. So what is an unfunded liability? So to measure an unfunded liability, we look at the assets and we look at, so what's the market value of those assets today? What do we have? And then we look at the liabilities. Since we're looking at the assets today, we also need to look at the liabilities for today. So as I mentioned, the actuaries come up with estimates of what the future string of retirement benefits being paid out will be for somebody's lifetime. And they'll do that for retirees, they'll do that for a new employee, they'll do that for everyone. And for example, a 10-year employee will have earned a portion of their future pension benefit. And so they will recognize a percentage of that as what's been earned. So whatever's been earned as of today, they estimate those future string of payments for the lifetimes of those members, and then discount those back to a present value. And that's very important to understand, because if we're comparing it to today's assets, we need to compare it with today's estimate of the liability. And the discount rate used to discount back the liabilities is the assumed rate of return. And that's going to be a key point to grasp onto, because I'm going to use that several times to explain how the math works. So now that we're looking at today's numbers, the difference between the assets and the liabilities is either overfunded or the unfunded liability. The other measure that's thrown around is the funded percentage, and it's using those same numbers, just the plan assets as of today over the present value of those liabilities. And so remember that the assets available to fund the liabilities are being presented in today's dollars, and our goal is to be 100% funded. We want to have the same number in assets to earn investment returns and have the cash available needed to meet the requirements of those benefits. But again, these are estimates about what that future liability is going to be. And so even if an employer is 100% funded, we need to remain diligent and remember those members are still going to continue. They're going to go to work next year and they're going to earn additional benefits. And we're also going to have investment risk, actuarial risk, the demographics may change, the estimates may change. So it takes constant vigilance of making sure where are we and how do we need to make these adjustments to the path that we're going on and how we're planning to pay these down. This is a pension funding equation from a very high level. This is how all pensions operate. So the right side are the uses of funds, the benefits and expenses. The expenses are the cost of running the agency. That's the use of all the money that comes into the trust. The left side are the sources. It's the contributions paid by the employers and the employees, and then the investment income earned on the assets. That's really the only two places that the cash comes into the plan. There's no other magical pot, so it needs to come from one of those two sources. So those unfunded liabilities, each employer has their own in tiers 1 and 2. They're not pooled together like ASRS. So we have 264 different plans, and those unfunded liabilities have been earned. And the pension clause in the state's constitution and the legal precedent set in the courts says that those have been earned and they cannot be diminished. So they are going to be paid. And so the reforms by the legislature a few years ago created Tier 3, which reduces the cost for employers, puts some restrictions around those benefits and how they grow. And so that's a good thing that was put in place. But the important thing to remember is the reforms did not reduce the tiers 1 and 2 unfunded pension liability. So that's what we refer to as a legacy cost. It's there, we can't change it, but all new employees will be going into tier 3. And those unfunded liabilities are a debt. They're liabilities that are owed. And so the amount and the timing of your contributions directly impact the funded status of your plan. And the way I like to explain this is every additional dollar contributed today can earn investment returns over the long term. But we need to remember that the opposite is also true. Every additional dollar not paid is a lost opportunity to earn those investment returns over the long term. So this is this pie chart is in the aggregate for the entire system. And so it represents the left side of that pension funding equation. Where's the cash come from that goes into the trust fund? So it either comes from the investment income, there's 45% in aggregate comes from investment income, and then 55% coming from contributions. And so that is system-wide, and we'll look at that for the city of Cottonwood here shortly. The numbers that we're going through on this presentation reflect the Cottonwood Police, but the fire would be the same math. It doesn't matter which plan it is, it's going to be the same math. We just picked up on the numbers for Cottonwood Police. So this is a graph to kind of give you a visual of that unfunded liability. And so over here on the left side, you can see the total present value of the liabilities is the total chart together. In the assets in the trust fund is a little over $9 million. And so by that simple math, the total liabilities minus the assets brings us to the unfunded liability, which is just under $12 million. Okay. So the takeaway, though, when we talk about that opportunity on the investment side, so the investment returns expected at 7.3%, are going to be earned on the $9 million in assets. If the plan was 100% funded, you'd be earning investment returns on the 21 million, the total present value of the liabilities, if it were 100% funded. So because there's a large unfunded liability, the current payment each year in terms of contributions on the unfunded liability is really to make up for that lost opportunity of the investment returns. And that's why the contribution part of that pie chart gets to be larger. And that payment is scheduled to grow at 3.5% into the future. The board took action that 3.5 is going to be decreasing, make it more of a flat payment over time. That may be getting a little bit too much in the weeds for this. And the other actuarial assumption changes are also going to be implemented. So that's going to change it over time, trying to get to more of a consistent and certain pay down of the unfunded liabilities. But this last bullet goes to that present value of the liabilities. So regardless of the funded status, that total 21 million in liabilities, because it's a present value number, next year it's going to be discounted one less year. And we use the assumed rate of returns as discount rate. So in essence, those total liabilities are going to increase 7.3% each year just by being discounted one less year. So if we think through the math on this, the left side looking at the assets is the cash coming in. We have the investments and the contributions of just under $2 million. And so looking at the unfunded liability of about 12 million, 2 million would be a pretty good pay down of that unfunded liability. But remember, the liability side is going to change also. So that present value is going to be discounted one less year. So you can see that growth is the total liabilities are actually going to increase 1.5 million in that present value calculation. So that 2 million in cash coming in is good, but you're really chasing that growth in the present value number on the liability side. So having an unfunded liability really makes it hard to catch up in just a few years. It's really going to be a long-term objective to get to. And this again is just a picture to kind of go through the previous slide with a picture in your mind. This is that just under 12 million in unfunded liability from 2020. The blue are the assets. So the assets come straight over. It's the beginning assets are the same number. We add in the orange, which are the investment returns. We add in the gray, which are the contributions, which is good. That increases the assets. But remember that total liability changed too. And so you can see the growth up here, which offsets a lot of what the cash coming in. So looking at a 1 year in terms of where the cash comes from, you can see the investments provide about 34% of the cash coming in, which would translate to 66% coming from the contributions, and the largest one being that unfunded actuarial liability portion of the contributions. So to compare this and give you a perspective of that opportunity on the investment side, if the Cottonwood Police Fund was 100% funded, we'd be estimating 80% of the cash coming from investment returns. So again, back to the pension funding equation. The investment income, we do what we can to get the investment returns there, but a huge increase in investment returns would be increasing that another 1%. But even increasing that 1% is not going to solve large unfunded liabilities over the short term. So additional contributions are really the main lever that can be used to take advantage of investment opportunities. And so the estimate that I had the actuaries put together is over a 17-year amortization. If we're paying down the unfunded liabilities over 17 years, an additional $1 million up front, an additional contribution will save taxpayers $1.8 million in contributions over that 17-year cycle. And in addition, at the end of that 17 years, that original $1 million would still be in the fund and still earning investment returns into the future. And then again, this continued diligence is even if you do put yourself in a position of being fully funded, every year it's going to take diligence on the part of management and the council to keep watching this, watch the investment risk, the actuarial risk, because again, these are long-term estimates going decades into the future. And so we need to stay vigilant and keep watching how this changes over time. So with that, stop to see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Townsend. We appreciate you being here. Appreciate the presentations. Council, do we have any questions? All right, we have some heads nodding over here. Councilmember Wilden.
One quick question. Do you handle your investments in-house, or do you use a firm, or how does that work, and what types of investments do you work?
We handle the investments in-house. We have a very diversified portfolio. It is, we have domestic equities in the stock market. We have international investments. We have private credit, private equities, hedge funds. There's many different types of diversified asset classes that we invest in. We have an internal staff. We have a chief investment officer plus 3 portfolio managers, and then some support staff of those individuals, as well as outside consultants that provide input and consulting advice.
All right, thank you. Any other questions? Mr. Townsend, I had just a couple of questions. Employees that are hired now, as opposed to in the past, are they all moving towards Tier 3?
Yes, anyone hired after July 1, 2017 is a Tier 3 member. They cannot, Tiers 1 and 2 are closed to new membership.
And so on Tiers 1 and 2, when will that legacy cost, as you called it, when will that diminish?
Well, it gets paid down over time. It depends on the amortization schedule that you're on. Most employers are on what was a 20-year, and it's on a closed period, so it's decrementing down towards 0. So those unfunded liabilities are mostly being paid off over 16 years now.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor, if I can add, I just want to be clear that on Tier 3, we're still paying the unfunded liability. So even though they're not contributing to that plan, they've replaced employees who were in that plan. So there is a significant charge on top of the normal charge for Tier 3 employees. So Tier 3 employees do save us money over the long haul, but they do not currently reduce our payments currently.
Okay, all right.
So it's kind of hard to follow and hear all of that. Are you guys, have you taken over the PRS management? So you're doing that. So my understanding was before this fund was managed by retired police and firemen.
Yeah, my official title is the administrator. So I'm the executive director of the agency. I was hired a little over a year ago. There is a board of trustees that are appointed by a combination of the governor and the Senate president and the Speaker of the House. There are member seats on that board of trustees. There are 2 law enforcement officer members and 2 firefighter members that sit on the board of trustees. And then there's 5 other individuals from around the state.
Okay, thank you. I mean, my understanding of in the past being a little reticent to do what we're talking about doing here is because of some bit of lack of confidence in the management of the fund. This is different now under your leadership?
This is completely different. We have essentially a new board of trustees. They have all been appointed in the past few years. As I said, probably 90% of my management team are all new individuals, and a lot of those I brought in from other state agencies that have the experience and professionalism. In February of last year, there was 1 CPA on staff at PSPRS, and that was me. As of today, we have 5 CPAs now on staff, including my deputy administrator and then within our accounting department. So we have really increased the professionalism. We have really increased the communication and the transparency through the advisory committee that includes the League of Cities and the county supervisors. That was really my primary objective in taking this job, because I was I hear the frustration in your voice and the lack of confidence that was there in the past, because that's exactly where I was at Coconino County for the past 20 years. And so I really wanted to come in and help get the communication and get the transparency there, open the communication, and rebuild the relationships about how do we find solutions together, because this is not about me and this job. This is not about even Coconino County. This is something that's important to the whole state. This unfunded liability could be it will be a hit to the economy. But if we don't fix this and get it right, it's going to be devastating to the Arizona economy.
Okay, thank you. That was very positive. I appreciate it.
Mr. Mayor, can I just ask maybe Mike to clarify? A lot of these changes happen because of statutorial changes, including the new makeup of his board. That changed several years ago, where that was addressed to fix some of the issues you were talking about. And then to Councilmember Wilden's issues about diversification, the laws were changed several years ago to allow greater diversification, because that hasn't always been the case.
Yes, and just to add a little more background to that, when the pension reforms took place, they created Tier 3 and a lot of the other changes, including the makeup of the board. A lot of those changes were put in place because of the work done by the League of Cities and Towns Pension Reform Task Force, which I don't think is too much of a coincidence, but the makeup of that task force that the League of Cities and Towns put together many years ago created a yardstick, which came up with a lot of those recommendations. The chair of that task force was Scott McCarty, who is now the chair of the Board of Trustees at PSPRS. And the vice chair of that task force was myself. So we've been working in this area, even though I've only been with the agency for a little over a year. We've been working in this area for many years.
All right, very good, Mr. Townsend. Thank you. Any other questions, Council, before we move on? Go ahead, Ron. Yeah, I believe we do have some more.
I think we'll be more available at the end, Councilmember Matthews.
Okay. All right, Mr. Townsend, thank you very much. And do you have more with your presentation, or do we turn it back over to Mr. Hamill at this point?
I'm ready to turn it over to Mr. Hamill.
Okay, good deal. Thank you, sir.
Very good. Thank you, Mike. We'll just take a minute and load our presentation. Mayor Alinsky, then we'll get started.
This is Jack Leeper at Stifel. Could I be given the presenter status? Thank you. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes, sir.
Excellent.
Okay, very good. Jack, appreciate that. Mayor Alinsky, members of the council, really appreciate Mike Townsend's involvement with our discussion tonight to give you that very needed and useful background with regards to the extent of this unfunded liability issue as it affects all of the plan participants in the state. Jack, if you could turn to slide 1, please. And Mr. Mayor, Council, just to emphasize what Mr. Townsend mentioned as far as the financial impact on the state, this pie chart shows the total unfunded actuarial liabilities statewide to PSPRS. And as you can see, it's approximately $9.85 billion. This is as of June 30 of last year. As you can see, the bulk of the liability rests with cities and towns that comprise about 62% of the total liability. Interesting, you'll see in that piece of the pie that's in navy blue, the state itself has a significant unfunded liability to PSPRS. And as you can imagine, the main departments that comprise the state's liability include the Department of Public Safety and also the Department of Corrections. The state itself is concerned about this liability and what the annual payments are to PSPRS to eliminate over time that liability. And the state itself has been looking into different options that are available, including the one that we're going to be discussing with the council tonight, to potentially deal with at least knocking down a portion of that substantial liability. So what this means is that this is a massive financial problem across many jurisdictions, and many of the PSPRS plan participants are evaluating options to best deal with the challenge and the cost of carrying this unfunded liability on their books. Now, one of those options, and that's what it is that we're going to be sharing with you this evening, is looking to take advantage of very low interest rates that exist in the market today, near historic low interest rates, as one option, with the idea of using debt to refinance this liability to the state at a lower interest rate than what Mr. Townsend described as being the 7.3% rate that's embedded in your liability payments as they currently exist. And again, this refinancing is just one option available to council, with potential benefits as well as risk, which we will share with you this evening. Next slide, please. Okay, now we want to drill down a little bit more specifically to the city of Cottonwood pension debt profile. Again, this is the tier 1 and tier 2 legacy costs. And as you can see, with regards to tier 1 and tier 2 employees and retirees for the police and fire departments, this information, which Mike alluded to, with regards to the police department, is a unfunded liability that currently exists of approximately $12 million. So that pension fund, using the ratio that Mike described in his presentation, is 43.2% funded. Now, when you add to that the unrecognized unfunded liability, this is a liability that has been gained, if you will, since June 30 of last year, adds another $1.5 million to that total. And then you have a timing adjustment that we indicated to April 30 of just about $125,000. And you can see that the unfunded liability is totally about $13.6 million. Now, if you look at the fire department, the liability is far less, approximately $4.3 million, and its funded ratio is higher at just over 71%. So in total, the city's unfunded liability to PSPRS is around $17.9 million. Now, the annual cost to service that liability is shown in the bar chart at the bottom of this slide. This is the city's so-called UAL amortization, unfunded actuarial liability amortization. This is the payment schedule that Mr. Townsend was referring to, that over time is established by PSPRS to ultimately eliminate that unfunded liability over a roughly 19 to 20 year amortization period. And as that cost grows, as you can see, it starts to crowd out other items in the city budget. So the question we ask is, how can this expenditure be more effectively managed and potentially refinance to generate a better outcome for the city? And with that, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, I'll pause there before I turn the discussion over to my colleague, Omar Dagestani from my Chicago office. Any questions from you, Mr. Mayor, or the council at this point?
Any questions from council for Mr. Hamill? No, sir, we're shaking our heads. I think you're free to pass the baton.
Okay. Thank you. I'll pass it on to Omar. Omar, take it away.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much for having me. And I have, first off, Mr. Mayor, Mr. Vice Mayor, and members of the council, and City Manager and Deputy City Manager, we've really enjoyed our conversations to date that we've had leading up to this conversation. I think if there's one thing we can all agree on, I think Grant had mentioned it earlier, I would certainly rather be spending the evening in Cottonwood tonight than here just north of Chicago, where I think our temperature is topping out at 9 degrees with a wind chill well below zero. So hopefully we'll all be able to be there in person together as we continue these conversations moving forward. I've actually worked coast to coast over the last 18 years on pension bonds totaling over $17 billion. And I wanted to just stop for a moment to share my observation. You heard from Mr. Townsend earlier. In all of that time, I have not had the chance to work with a state pension fund executive director or administrator that is more qualified, more passionate, and more engaged than Mr. Townsend. And I'm not saying that just because we're here tonight. And I'm certain that's something that you will find over time. As Grant had mentioned, if you're to consider Cottonwood's funding profile, for police, you fall right around the 43% funded ratio, and for fire it is better at 71%. But the important thing to take away here is, we have a bunch of key actuarial terms here, and when you're to consider a lot of the technical language, it can get rather heavy and weighty. But the bottom line here is that for every dollar of unfunded liability you have, that is essentially a debt-like instrument. It is constitutionally guaranteed under the Arizona State Constitution, and it is a debt-like instrument carrying a rate of 7.3% based on the assumptions as Mr. Townsend and Mr. Hamill had indicated earlier. And so the opportunity here is very much one in which we can take that debt and refinance it at a lower rate, the bond rate that we'll talk about in just a minute, very much akin to refinancing your higher rate mortgage for a lower rate mortgage and generating expected savings. Jack, if we go to the next page. Thank you. So currently, we take a look at, when you do this kind of analysis, there's a variety of things that you need to demonstrate to rating agencies, to investors, and frankly, to yourself to generate good public policy. To ask yourself, is this a good idea? And to do that, we like to do what's known as a matched comparison, by which we compare the payments that you'd otherwise make if you were not to make any change in policy. And those are currently shown in red bars and are boxed in the table to the right, and total approximately, in this instance, 35 million of total payments from 2021 to 2039. And so we ask ourselves, if we have this liability, again, we mentioned, the UAL, and we're to replace all those payments that we're otherwise going to have to get to pay off that 17 million and some odd change, what would our new payments be, and how would we compare those? And we see that in the next page. So, and I guess before we get to that next page, what we see here is, if we don't make any changes, or we could go back, Jack. Thank you. If we don't do anything, we continue to make those payments that are shown in the red bars. And, the payments, that unfunded liability will continue to be accruing interest at the rate of 7.3%. You could simply put more money in on a cash basis, which over time would, potentially pay that sooner. But unless you have that entire amount to pay it off, you are still accruing any unfunded amount at 7.3. Or option 3, which we're going to talk about in just a moment, would be to take the PSPRS liability. Again, that's for the tiers 1 and 2. Mr. Townsend had noted that there's the new tier 3 that you have for new employees that's more efficient. And frankly, I'll mention something about the tier 3 in just a moment. But I think it's very good news for you. But your option 3 here is that you can refinance that debt-like unfunded liability of 7.3 with bonds that we estimate to cost about 2.75. So now here's where we get to the exciting page. Go to the next page, Jack. And this is really just to demonstrate why rates are so low. This page with the 10-year Treasury, again, you're really capturing the market at a very good time relative to history, because obviously the lower the borrowing rate the 10-year Treasury, the lower your borrowing rate. The next page, Jack. Thank you. So this is probably my very favorite page that we can talk about. What is this actually worth when we build it up and compare the red line is the payments that you'd otherwise be making to what happens if you're to go ahead with this option 3 and do a borrowing. Now, a couple of things about this. One, we assume the idea of not wanting to ever exceed the payments that you'd otherwise be making, and so we structure the debt as such. You'll notice there's never a time where the debt is higher than what you're paying, but there's no expected savings in those early years. And really, you're using that difference in cost to, what we call chop down the mountain. And we think that that's a really positive thing in a couple of respects. One, it gives you, present value savings. But 2, it gives you some budget certainty that you don't always have this escalating cost that, for the number of municipalities that we've spoken with throughout Arizona and throughout the nation, nobody wants to keep paying in big dollar amounts and see their payment keep going up. People are really looking for that opportunity to have a more stable, predictable payment stream. And so to talk about the numbers, if you were to move forward as proposed, or pursue this idea, really, the pension fund, you'd wire at closing $17.8 million. You'd also put together a contingent reserve fund, which my colleague Claude will be talking about in a moment, of $2.3 million. And, in doing all of this, you'd actually generate a present value savings on an expected basis of $8.7 million, or just about 50% savings. As a comparison, when you are to consider what would, if you were looking at what would be good savings or an efficient way to consider this for a debt refinancing, typically the threshold that people would think of is 3 or 4%. And in this instance, you're many multiples well above that, which only speaks to the strength of the opportunity and the low rate environment we have there. I know that I've said a lot. I'd like to pause there for a minute, Mr. Mayor and members of the council, to see if there are any comments or questions.
Council, do we have any questions for Mr. Dagestani?
Oh, that's great. I'm impressed.
Well, now hang on. We got one for you.
I'm not sure when the right time is.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds like we're gonna let you carry on. I'll share one comment with you though. It's really nice here in Arizona, and I don't want to rub it in too bad, but you are missing out on some pretty keen weather. And my sister-in-law lives in Chicago, and I dropped her off at the airport on Saturday, and she cried. But I I don't think it was because she's going to miss me. I think it's because it was about two degrees when she landed. So we have it pretty good out here, but please don't tell anyone.
I am impressed that you were able to get her on the plane, and hopefully I'll be able to visit at some point in the not too distant future. But yeah, I entirely understand what you're saying.
All right. Yeah, you can go ahead with your presentation. We're going to save our questions, I think, until the end.
Okay, fantastic. We can move. So now you look at this type of expected savings, and really a great public policy outcome. Why are some? The first thing I ask myself is, why would somebody not want to do this? And indeed, there are some risks to consider. Risks that, in fact, I will review on the next page. And in fact, this is just a tabular form of the data. If you're reviewing it in printed format, you can see the expected cash flow savings. And thank you, Jay. And I will turn it over to Claude Lockhart, my colleague who works in this space, to talk a little bit about the risks and opportunities. And actually, Claude, I think we're having a hard time hearing you. Still not. Well, we'll let Claude work on his sound for a moment. I can take us through the risks, and then Claude can enter momentarily. Okay. So, when we consider the risks of a pension bond, the biggest risk that you have out there is market risk, right? When we spoke with Mr. Townsend, I know there was a discussion around what is the how are things invested? And I know there have been a lot of changes, but the primary risk of your liability currently is, not earning that 7.3% on average over the long term. Now, and I would certainly encourage, that review. And I know Mr. Townsend had covered that. That's a risk that you currently have, whether you do the pension bonds or not. It's one that is magnified or not magnified, probably more focus on it if you are to examine a pension bond. Specifically, if you're to do a pension bond and you earn less over the next 17 or 20 years than the assumed borrowing rate, you'd save less than is shown. If you earn less than, in this instance, the 2.75%, you're worse off. Now, I'm not an expert in investments. We serve as municipal bond underwriters. However, looking at the history of PSPRS, and frankly, looking nationally at pension funds, if you're to earn less than the 2.75% over the coming 20 years, something really bad has happened in the market. It's probably something even worse than a 2008. You're probably going to be worried about a lot more than, having done a pension bond, if that's to come to bear. But it is, the primary risk that, you ought to consider when looking at this. Actuarial risk. If I'm to think over the last 20 years since I've started doing this, one of the things we've always seen is that there's this creep of unfunded liability, and people always want to blame the investment return risk. But in fact, a lot of it is due to actuarial changes. There's some good news that has occurred in the world in the last 20 years. People are living longer. And in living longer, that's great news for all of us and for our families, not great news for the pension man. And in fact, that's something that slowly, can add to your unfunded liability. In fact, I often share with people, and I hope none of you are actuaries, but I always have an actuary joke or two in mind when we talk about pensions. And one of the things I would observe over my career is you know, when an actuary comes to say, I have a new experience table, it's almost never good news. It's almost always, you know, look, people are living longer or something, not good news for the math. And so that's something to consider too. And then, you know, the other risk that I would put out there is the funding target risk. You know, again, we're funding things based on a report and a snapshot in time, but that's something that can certainly shift and mitigate as we're to move forward. So I will stop there if there are questions. Otherwise, we can talk about how we mitigate those a bit.
All right. Any questions during this pause, Council? No, sir. You're free to move forward.
Fantastic. Thank you. So we have contingency reserve fund, and I see Claude is back. We've gone through the risks, Claude. Claude, do you have any ways that we can mitigate them? Claude, I think we're still in. I'm so sorry. We're still having problems.
Hi, good evening. Can everyone hear me now?
Oh, here he is. Fantastic.
Yep, we can hear you, Mr. Lockhart. Go ahead.
Very sorry about that. Good evening. I beg your pardon. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. Really nice to be here talking with you tonight. Thanks, Omar, for covering those risks. On this slide, we wanted to cover the contingency reserve fund idea that we had posed before. And I want to start by saying this isn't something that's absolutely necessary to move forward with the financing. It's also not a tool that must be bond funded. We've had several issuers that have decided to instead use available cash on hand to fund a contingency reserve fund. But really the tool here is to come up with a sum of money, a corpus of money that can be set aside and dedicated to managing the ongoing liability. So as Omar had mentioned, you know, there's a variety of risks that are inherent, whether or not you do a pension financing, the biggest one being the market risk, but also the actuarial risk. So the idea behind this fund is that we have essentially a side fund of money to where if you have negative experiences, let's just say people live longer over time. Let's say that the fund earns 6% instead of 7.3%, things along those lines. You would have a sum of money on the side to help sort of mitigate the new unfunded liability that's created over time. We like to think of this as a tool that's really more for managing the more severe changes that you might experience. So, you know, as opposed to the fund maybe earning 7.1% in a year, as opposed to 7.3%, you know, you might try to access this when you have something where you have, let's just say, you know, the fund returns 0% or you have a downturn in the market. So that's sort of the idea here. You know, we set forth on this page some of the things that we've handled for other issuers, you know, essentially rules for investments of proceeds. Obviously, we want to have something that's principal protected. We're not going to put all this in GameStop stock, obviously. We want to have this money available for the long term. We also set up rules for CRF draws, as well as replenishment. So over time, you know, this is supposed to be a sustainable tool that allows you to manage that potential liability for the long term. So as opposed to, you know, taking it all out in the next 10 years and then having nothing left, we like to set up some sort of rules for replenishment, obviously something that's very doable for the city. In any case, I'll pause there. Omar, anything else to add there?
No, I think you hit it really well. And I will add one amplification to the contingent reserve fund. For all of the conversations we've had with rating analysts who provide ratings for the city and on your bonds, as well as investors and other market participants, the feedback that we've had for the contingent reserve fund has been really spectacularly good. Even if you look at BlackRock, who is one of the larger New York based investors, they had actually stopped, and they're normally, how should I say, kind of rough. And when we took this structural feature through an investor call that we had with BlackRock for the Flagstaff transaction, they stopped to say, hey, look, you guys have really created something where you've addressed the primary risks of this kind of transaction in a really elegant way. And you know, they liked it, rating analysts liked it. And, you know, it's something, obviously, if you're to move forward with this this type of transaction, it's something to be considered. As Claude said, you don't have to do it. I would share, though, I think it's really central to good public policy. It's really to protect you and the city, because when we do these type of transactions, a lot of bond transactions, if you fund a road, you hire an underwriter, they get you the money, and then you go build your road. For a pension transaction, this is something that, for the transactions I've done over my career, we're there for the lifetime. We're there as questions and opportunities come up. And questions could be, challenges of, gee, what do I do with my reserve fund? Or, gee, things have changed in this way. But there are also opportunities. I would share, I worked on a transaction in 2003 for the state of Wisconsin. And there have been a number of things we've had to do to keep them fully funded, which they remain fully funded. But as the rating criteria has evolved and changed over the years, we've used what we've done there to earn them a number of credit upgrades, 4 of them, actually, if you're to count. And they went from being a moderate single A credit to being a strong double A credit. Again, really as part of that. So, a lot of things to consider, and we're certainly there to help. We'll go to the next page, Jack. So, this is really just to speak to that kind of experience and that sort of long-term commitment that we have. And, one of the things, we've worked with the city of Yuma County, Pinell County, Gila County, the city of Flagstaff we've mentioned. We're currently expected, I believe, and there's a preliminary offering statement out. We're a joint book runner to price the city of Tucson, and it's actually a little bit bigger now. It'll be about $658 million, and that'll be pricing sometime late next week. So look forward to report back to you on that. But it's really a strategy that has been very popular in Arizona. The timing has never been better. A lot of good structural things have happened at PSPRS. At this time, I'd like to just pause and say thanks for the opportunity to talk with you tonight, and ask if there are questions or things we wanted to discuss.
All right, any questions?
Yes, I had some questions, and mostly just because this is a lot of pretty technical information that I'm trying to wrap my head around. But Mr. Dagestani, you just used a key word, and that is timing. You think the timing is good. We've heard timing is key, and it sounds like we would want to issue, if we were to move forward with a pension, a type of bond, we would want to issue when the market was fairly bottomed out or low, and when the interest rates are low as well. So right now it seems as though the market's a little volatile. It's kind of hard to say what's going to happen next. So your company's response to that was to create this CRF fund to address that volatility. What would be your company's recommendation as far as a funding amount for that CRF? And would we have to come up with that amount ourselves as a city in cash or other assets, or would that be an additional amount through the bond process?
No, thank you so much. A great question. And a couple of things. The CRF is intended to manage the volatility over the long term of the investment side of the things that PSPRS is investing in, or the actuarial risk that might be there. In terms of the borrowing rates, it is true. There has been a lot of movement. Treasury rates have started to tick upwards a bit, and you can see, thank you, Jack. If you're to look, I think right around when Flagstaff and some of the others came, in the summer and in the fall, in October, Treasury rates were, the 10-year Treasury, which is sort of a benchmark that we'd use for a lot of the transaction, was 0.4% lower than it is right now for the city of Yuma that we did a few weeks ago. Now, the interesting thing there is, despite the fact that Treasury rates have increased, we have actually been able to keep the borrowing rate for the cities and our issuers approximately approximately the same, considering their credit and how long they're borrowing for and all of those things, largely by the fact that there is voracious demand from market participants. And we've been really aggressive at marketing. I'd mentioned earlier that we've been marketing with New York investors, BlackRock, but we've literally gone across the country, and we hold a Salesforce teach-in, and we talk with our salespeople around the country, and we bring in enough investors so that they are going crazy to get your bonds and give you a lower borrowing cost because they're competing for them. And so I think, to answer your questions, the contingent reserve fund will help manage that equity risk. The sort of market borrowing risk is something that we manage through aggressive marketing. And relative to the sizing of that, we have some estimate that we've put in here. And I would say that that is very much a customized solution that we would work with finance and the city manager and the team to come up with a specific recommendation that meets Cottonwood's public policy objectives.
Mayor, can I add a comment in there?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I think I heard kind of two pieces of that question. One was around the borrowing rate, and the other was about the markets being at all-time high. And so I just, which is actually a very good point to bring up, and I wanted to clarify if the city of Cottonwood were to do, whether it's a debt financing or some other option, but if there are additional contributions that come in, PSPRS is not going to take, if we have domestic equities in the stock market, we're not going to take 25% of the money you put in and go put that in the stock market. You would actually be buying into an existing portfolio. Right now, it's about $12.5 billion with percentages that are in a lot of alternative investments, including some of the longer term private equity deals that can be 8 to 10 years over time to get the total returns. And so you'd be many years down buying into those existing deals that are already in place. So we would look at your funding that's coming in and figure where's the opportunistic area where we need to put that, not just spread it across everything across the board. So we would manage how that money is invested and put into the overall trust portfolio. Thank you.
Thank you. I think what Councilmember Henry also asked was roughly how much we need to put in that contingency reserve fund and where would the city of Cottonwood find that money?
So, Mr. Mayor, if I can add real quick, on page 8, they've included that information. Gentlemen, tell me if I'm incorrect, but I see a $2.3 million in the CRF on that page.
But is that wrapped into the bond amount, or is that something that we have to come up with in cash or other assets?
That is currently, we're showing that wrapped into the bond amount. Now, if you decided for some reason that the city had an extra 2.3 million, then you didn't want to borrow and you wanted to keep your issue size smaller, you could certainly put it in terms of cash. But a number of people have done that by way of borrowing. And as I said, unless your cash positions are so that you have that type of extra cash that you didn't wish to deploy elsewhere, you could go ahead and borrow it, but you certainly could do that in cash as well. So we only make that point just to provide you that option. But as it is shown in the analysis, it is shown as a borrowed amount.
Okay, thank you.
That begs one more question then. I think, and I'll go into this in detail later, but I think we're talking about borrowing $17 million to pay off the unfunded pension liability. So would this 2 whatever million in this CRF fund, would that be on top of the $17 million for the bond?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, so we'd be borrowing that on top of what it would take to pay off. Thanks.
That's right.
But Mr. Mayor, if I can add, the savings presented on this slide, should have taken my glasses off, the 8.7 million includes those costs. So all the numbers presented tonight include both options.
That's right. And all the numbers are net of that additional borrowing that you would need for that reserve fund. And in fact, Jack, if we could go back one slide. Thank you. Yeah, you'll see the total present value benefit, again, $8.7 million. and that includes the 2.3 contingent reserve fund. That includes the $17.8 million deposit to PSPRS. It includes all expenses, so that you don't need to come up with any additional money other than to make debt service payments, which are equal or lower than the payments you'd otherwise be making.
All right, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Any other questions from council? Mr. D'Agostani, did you have more to present, or did either of your colleagues have more to present?
Grant, I'll turn it back to Grant if there are any other comments or.
Thank you, Omar.
Okay, all right, we're just bubbling over with questions here, so I wanted to make sure the time was right. So.
No, that concludes our presentation, and we'd be happy to respond to any additional questions, Mayor.
All right, good deal. Councilmember Henry, did you have some questions? No, you're good.
So again, this is all new for me. So I did have a question. So how does your company get paid through the process? Is it a set fee amount? Is it a percentage, or is that included in the chart on page 8? And if so, where is that?
Omar, do you want to respond to that, or I would be happy? Go ahead.
Either way, it's included in the numbers that are shown on page 8 and 9. That is all net of the fees. It's something that would typically be discussed and negotiated, as we work, and it is typically something that is done as a percentage of the borrowing, as a way to compensate the sales force, as well as the professional services rendered for the structuring and assembling the transaction. But everything that you see here is net of those fees.
Thank you. So what is that percentage or the percentage range typically?
I would add that the costs that were factored into our analysis would be comparable to, let's just say, a $20 million debt sale for, various capital improvements. So that would include an underwriting fee to compensate the sales force and our bankers for structuring and managing the financing. I think for purposes of discussion, that would be estimated at around 1%. And then you'd have additional costs for legal fees with the attorneys that would be involved in the transaction, the fees that would be paid to the rating agencies for assigning a rating to the financing. And again, those fees would be comparable to a more traditional debt financing. And I would estimate for a transaction that we're talking about this evening, those fees would probably range in the $150,000 to $225,000 range, somewhere in there.
And can you clarify that? Was that the fees for legal and the rating agencies, or is that all of the fees, including the 1%?
No, the 1% would be separate. That would be a fee just for the underwriting of the bonds. The other cost of issuance that I mentioned for legal and rating agencies, that would be on top of the 1%.
And I appreciate that clarification. So is that the number, or are those the numbers and the percentage that were included in our spreadsheet on page 8?
Yes, I believe those were the assumptions that were used in determining what we estimated to be the debt service payments for a financing that would provide sufficient funds to eliminate your unfunded liability to PSPRS and to fund the contingency reserve fund.
Thank you.
Councilmember Wilden, did you have some questions as well? Go ahead.
Who are you under? Are you under SEC, or who is the guiding light behind you?
It seems like every regulatory agency at times, but yes, we're overseen by a number of regulators that includes the SEC overall as our regulatory agency, but also beneath the SEC is FINRA, FNRA, which oversees the activities of brokerage firms like Stifel.
Go ahead.
Last question. You mentioned, as far as the bonds go, how far out do you typically go on bonds?
Well, that's, it's an interesting question. And we typically like to do what's known as an asset liability match. And so in this instance, if you were to take no action, that's sort of option A, you would otherwise make payments through 2038 or 39. And in this instance, we like to match the debt as closely to it as possible. And so in this instance, you'd be borrowing through 2039. Actually, it's slightly shorter because we don't bother with that final year because you have enough savings to shorten it by a year. But our general objective is to match or shorten. And that's, again, another thing that we found to be a positive for rating agencies.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions amongst council here?
So I feel like I'm in a shell game. I'm trying to follow the ball. So I'm just going to try to, in my mind, try to boil this down to layman's terms so I understand. Maybe it might help somebody else. But so we have an unfunded pension liability of $17 million, which is costing us 7.3% essentially every year in interest. We're paying. Okay. So then we're looking at borrowing the money to pay that off. Is that right?
Correct.
Yes, that's right.
So we're going to borrow money at 2.75%. We're going to get rid of the 7.3%. So we're leveraging our money there? Okay, because I mean, if I could borrow money at 2% and go out and make 7%, I'm making 5%. So where does the investment vehicle in this come from? Is it that 17 million plus what we already have in there now is the investment vehicle which is bringing us a return?
Yes, it's those monies that are invested at PSPRS as Mr. Townsend had delineated.
Okay, so we have the PRS people there and we have Stifel. How are you guys related?
We are a bond underwriter. We help underwrite the bonds and get the debt side of it. We help you find investors to achieve the lowest borrowing cost.
Okay.
That's 2.75%.
So you're just the bond. You're just the bond guy, and our investment is within the pension system.
Yes, that's right. We do not touch the investments. That is done exactly as it would be done if you made the contributions on an annual basis or any other basis you did.
Okay, thank you. Boiling it down to that, I mean, it looks like it's a good way to leverage our money to pay off our pension. So then, what is the expected return on that investment? In other words, the 17%, the $17 million that we're putting into that fund that's going to be invested, what do they expect a percentage every year of that return to be?
The assumed rate of return that our actuaries have used is 7.3% return.
So then the only thing we're going to be liable for is what we're typically liable to put in every year after that. We're going to be able to keep up with that. In other words, is this getting us out of the weeds permanently, essentially?
Never permanently. As the risks were mentioned, there could be changes that could happen at PSPRS. The state legislatures could change things. Investments could not come to 7.3%. They could change our actual numbers again. Life expectancy is probably not exactly right yet. Our payroll expected rate of increase is probably, Cottonwood is probably not reaching that just yet. But the one thing I am pretty sure on is that unfunded liability is not going to go down. And I can also pretty much assure you that in the years out, in 34, maybe in 28, we're going to have a hard time paying that bill. And the bill payment is not optional. it's not something that we would have the ability to not pay. So there are other ways to solve this problem. Prescott passed a sales tax dedicated to this of significance. So there are other ways to do it, and just keep paying it, as he mentioned, option A. But the debt's not going to disappear on its own, and it takes significant upfront money if we wanted to really make any kind of dent in it.
So I get it. I understand. This is like refinancing your house, but there's some market volatility involved that you don't have with that, and that we're underwater now and we're only sinking. So okay, so I appreciate that. I get that. The only thing above and beyond that, I'd love to hear what staff, finance staff, has to say about that and what their opinion is of this.
Yeah, and I think that's what Councilmember Matthews brought up speaks to one of my concerns, which is we're taking our unfunded liability, we're taking a snapshot in time and paying that off. But moving forward, I kind of want to know what our plan is to manage that and what to expect, moving forward until the legacy fund is essentially diminished to zero. So I know that this is going to give us a lot of stability in budgeting, in the years ahead. But I know it's not a fix 100%. So just curious, how, what our plan is moving forward.
Well, this is Kirsten. Again, by paying down the unfunded liability right now, that decreases our portion of the contribution that has to be paid in every year. Currently, we're paying for next year, our percentage is over $2 million. So it would be reduced down by more than half in that sense, because we wouldn't be paying the 68% for police that we currently are. So it's going to save money that way, and then we pay the bonding with those savings. I personally feel like at this time, this is a good time to do this with the way the market is and the rates are so low. And I think that having that, I really like the idea of the contingency reserve to help if there is any issues that come up in the future with the public safety's investments or any other type of actuarial changes.
Mr. Mayor, before we ask Rudy if he's still on the line to comment, sometimes as a manager and then the finance team, we feel our hands are tied to handle this debt. This is, in my opinion, created significantly by others, but we do have some responsibility. We do have a couple options. For example, making sure that we don't allow pension spiking. So in certain cities and towns, the last few years of the retirement, all your senior officers or firefighters get all the overtime. And so it creates an increase in your unfunded liability that was not paid for over the 20 or 25 years of that officer or firefighter's career. We can be careful to make sure that our retirement boards are appropriately awarding medical retirements to those who are truly deserving, that earned it or that it happened on the job. That just things managerially that we can do. I think the impact is small, but we'll continue to do that. And as our folks move as we hire new folks into Tier 3, that has a whole different payment structure, including a 50-50 contribution rate between the employer and the employee, I think that there are things built in to help control that. But you asked what our plan is, and our plan is to keep an eye on the ball to make sure that we're not doing things to increase our own debt as an employer, and then making sure that the employees get what they've earned. This is not the fault of any one employee or a firefighter. They've earned it. They signed up for a contract. This was committed to them, and we got to make sure that we can afford to pay our debt. But we'll keep the eye on the ball even if we move with this.
I have two more questions, but they may be more appropriate for. I don't know if someone. Go ahead. Yeah, Rudy. Two more questions. I'm not sure if they should be directed to you. I think probably the first one was we're looking at a fund or one obligation that's 40% approximately funded, and then the second that's approximately 70% funded. So if we were to move in the direction of a pension pension fund obligation. I'm sorry, there's just a lot of different terms that I'm trying to wrap my head around. Excuse me, folks. But is that an appropriate strategy for both obligations where they're so differently funded? That's the first question. Then I had a second follow-up as well.
Certainly, I think it would be the most appropriate way to do it. I don't think we should try to detach either of those. And for the most part, when these pensions have been issued, these pension obligations have been issued, it's been to cover both of them. There's a certain comfort level. If you had asked me, 2 to 24 months, do we want to go that route? I would have probably said no. We don't want to bond for anything, but over the last 12 to 18 months, watching the leadership change, the new legislation that have come in over the last few years, I'm feeling a lot more comfortable with actually going out and doing this type of a transaction. But I would not. There's nothing, I think, to be gained by going out and separating or trying to separate either of those two.
Thank you for that. Then my second question has to deal with our credit rating and our overall debt capacity, because we're looking at, we've got approximately, 20 more years if we were to move forward with this. So what would that mean for us down the road as far as both our credit and our debt capacity? And it's my understanding these are not tax exempt, and you can correct me if that's wrong.
Our tax or our rating, I don't recall exactly what it is. It's an A or an A plus thereabouts. We're in relatively good shape. It doesn't affect our capacity. We're one of the few cities that has been issuing revenue bonds, and as such, we haven't yet to even begin to consider a GO bond, which would be backed by property taxes. Many of the communities down in the southern part of the state actually use their property taxes to leverage a lot of their debt. We, on the other hand, have been real fortunate that we either have been using our excise taxes to cover it, and we've always been ensured that we've always covered our debt service before we ever cover any other of our operating expenses.
Did that answer your question?
No, Mr. Mayor, if I can, maybe one of the other gentlemen from can help answer that. I think the real question is this limit our future ability to borrow money? And is this, looks like new debt, even though the debt's been on the books through PSPRS, does it affect our overall rating to add this?
I mean, you can't buy a AAA rating like you used to 15 years ago?
Well, if I could just add there, Ron, my perspective on that. The city has always enjoyed a pretty solid investment grade rating. We think, as Omar mentioned in his presentation, when you present to the rating agencies a financing of this type, which we've characterized as a refinancing of existing debt to the state and effectively replacing that at a lower rate of interest, that's generally been seen by the rating agencies as a positive credit factor. Now we're understanding of the fact that once you leverage your excise tax or sales tax revenue for a financing like what we're discussing this evening, what type of capacity does that leave the council with regards to future projects that might lend themselves to debt financing, such as a new city hall, for example, down the road? And we've had some discussions with Rudy and Kirsten with regards to, what would be the estimated cost of those projects down the road. And based upon our analysis of the city's excise tax revenues and the extent with which those revenues would cover debt service associated with these bonds, we believe that there would be ample coverage for additional debt down the road whenever that might present itself. But again, I think a council member asked, would these be taxable obligations? And the answer is yes. The taxable bond yields are extremely low right now, but because of the fact that these proceeds are being put into an investment fund, that would earn ostensibly a higher rate of interest than the rate on the bonds, the IRS would not allow this type of issuance to be done on a tax-exempt basis, but only on a taxable basis. So the advantage that we're seeking in a perfect world is to borrow at a rate, we're assuming at 2.5 to 2.75%, and putting those monies into an investment account at PSPRS, as Mike Townsend described, and having those funds over time earn at a rate of approximately 7.3%. So this is what we refer to in our industry parlance as arbitrage, where you borrow at a single rate and you invest the money at a higher rate. And that's the perceived benefit of doing this type of transaction.
Does that answer your question?
That did. Thank you
thanks.
to all who provided input on that.
Councilmember Wilden?
One quick question. When would this, as far as the city goes, when would this take effect, or if we ended up doing it?
Yes, good question. If the council decided to move forward with this transaction, we would get to work with your bond attorney to start preparing the legal documents as well as the offering document associated with the bonds. And we would estimate that process, that time frame would be around 10 to 12 weeks from beginning to end. That would be the bond closing, in which the monies would be wire transferred to PSPRS. And if the council elected to fund that contingency reserve fund, that would be established at closing as well, again, with the proceeds of the bond issue, if that's what the council decided to do.
Mr. Mayor, I need Kirsten or Rudy to also let us know about budget capacity, because I know that plays a factor in this. Kirsten and Rudy, I know you guys were going to look at that to make sure we had budget capacity.
I think we have the budget capacity. We will probably have to do a budget revision as we move forward. But we do have we have budget capacity. We don't have the allocation yet, so we'll have to come to council and get an allocation. Am I correct there, Kirsten?
Yeah, we have the capacity. We would just have to have council approve putting those funds into the general fund. So.
All right. Very good.
So thank you to everybody on there that has taken something that kind of looked hopeless up to this point and looks like it's kind of a pretty good solution here. So I love the idea of leveraging the money and making that work for us. I like the interest rates we're getting into, but like there's always another side to it. I'm not really thrilled about where the market is right now for jumping in, but that's just the way it is. I think in the short term, I've bet all my chips on a nice correction. So I do hope that happens, but I think over the years, I think we can't really lose on this. I think it's a great solution. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you for having us. We really appreciate the opportunity to speak with council tonight, and appreciate Mr. Townsend from PSPRS allocating some time to participate in the meeting as well.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Hamill. I've known you for 15 years since I've served here, and I know you've done a lot of transactions with the city. You certainly never steered us wrong, and it's clear you're very conservative in your estimates, and obviously you're a penny pincher. They've already shut the lights off at your office there, so I can tell you're doing all you can on your end to save money. So we appreciate that very much.
Yeah. All right, thank you, Mayor. It's a pleasure as always. Thank you.
Council, does this seem like something that we want to pursue further? I get the sense that we do, but just want to make sure that we've heard from everyone.
I have a question.
Sure.
Are we going to hear alternatives from staff, such as if we went the route that Prescott went, what that would look like?
Councilmember Henry, I appreciate. Kirsten, was that you? Did you want to add?
Yeah, we didn't calculate what going for our sales tax would be, because we didn't figure that this time we'd want to introduce a new sales tax. But if you want to hear that, we can definitely work on numbers.
I don't necessarily, I'm not a fan of increasing taxes, but there's risk. I tend to be more risk averse than others. And when you Google these types of obligations, again, you hear use caution, you hear terms like risky gimmick, you hear the GFOA who's not a fan. And I agree with Councilmember Matthews, it sounds great on paper, but there are, again, risks involved. So before moving forward, I think it would be prudent to know if we had to do something, an alternative, such as the city of Prescott did, what would that look like for Cottonwood?
Mayor, Council, one of the reasons we haven't really looked at that is, and one of the reasons that Prescott did that, their sales tax was below 9% when they did the actual changes. Ours was already at it's already reaching close to 10% in our sales tax. But we can go ahead, by all means, go ahead and run some numbers for you. I am certain Kirsten probably has those, can get those fairly quick. Again, we would be pushing our sales tax right at about 10% overall.
So just one thing to add, I think staff needs, somebody needs to determine then what this contingency reserve fund should look like for us to consider to mitigate some of the risk that's in there.
And independently would be good. You know, again, a lot of what you see on the internet is this should be a tool utilized by well-funded organizations or fiscally sound organizations, and I'm not sure we're there. And so I would like to hear staff, you know, again, what are our options? Is this the only option, or what are some of the other avenues that we might have to explore moving forward? I'm not opposed to this. Again, I like the general concept is simple. But I do think that personally I'd like to learn more information before we do go down a potentially risky route.
And Mr. Mayor, members of the council, I just wanted to address the internet and if you're to Google pension borrowings. As I said, I've worked for the last 18, 19 years in this space. And I would agree with you. If this is a powerful tool that when it is misused, i.e. rather than spreading the savings and putting them on the back, you take everything on day one, like New Jersey did, let's say. Or, you know, you put in interest rate swaps and use things other than traditional fixed rate debt. You know, that'd be another one that wouldn't be great. Or you don't do things like include a contingency reserve fund. You know, I agree with you, and I share your disdain for any of those type of risky structures. As I said, I've done this for 18 years. I have an 8-year-old son, soon to be 9, this weekend. And frankly, I plan to be doing this for a while. And I know Grant and I share this belief that, you know, we put forward a very sound and traditional and well thought out structure for you and your staff to consider. And so, but I certainly, I think I agree with your approach of wanting staff to, you know, talk about those risks independently. You know, I think that certainly makes sense, but again, appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today.
Mr. Mayor, can I, Mr. Townsend, you're still on the line there, and I really appreciate you staying on. I try to stay up to date on PSPRS and what others are doing to solve this problem, because I think, I don't know that I'll be here in 39. That's a many years out. Hope to be retired by then. But the payment that would be due at that time would take up a significant portion of our city budget. But Mr. Townsend, am I missing, what other things have cities done other than initiate a sales tax or bond? Is there another option that staff could consider that you've seen done in Arizona?
In Arizona, that's been primarily what's happened. Other than that, it's been using cash available on hand. We were in a fortunate situation at Coconino County. We had a capital facility fund where we set aside general fund dollars, and we use those to pay down the unfunded liability. So it really is, I think you're asking all the right questions, all the appropriate questions. I do agree with Mr. D'Agostani. It's the GFOA guidance is very risk averse, to me, it's no different than issuing debt for an infrastructure project. There's times when it's appropriate and there's times when it's not appropriate. And I think you need to look at all of the variables and really analyze the risk and make sure it's the right decision for you.
All right. All right. So, Council, again, how would you like to proceed? We've heard a good presentation this evening. A lot of information, very thorough. I think maybe another work session with staff to explore some other options, or maybe just some meetings individually with council members. How would you like to proceed with this?
I'm not a fan of individual meetings with council members. I think this is a matter where the city needs to be as transparent as possible. Pardon me, Mayor. And I actually think what we've heard tonight was very good, useful information. I think we would be remiss if we didn't move forward with exploring what happens next with Steeple. I just would also like to have information from staff, which could be sent through an email. Here is perhaps, we have recent numbers from our most recent sales tax increase. Here's what we can consider. And then perhaps as we're having the topic agendized for the next step, we're just at the very beginning stages here. Again, I didn't hear anything tonight that made me say, let's pull the plug on potential significant, almost 10 million, 8-something million dollars worth of potential savings. I just think there are some questions that I'd like answered.
But you're okay getting those questions answered? Just if staff would email us information on what a sales tax would look like? Okay, and then we'll bring this back up for a vote then to move forward? Or,
which we'd need to do at a regular meeting, and
right.
Having additional information and the alternatives, I think, would make for a much more well-informed.
Okay. Ron, does that give you what you need to move forward?
If pleases council.
Council, any other thoughts, comments?
I would agree with what Council Member Henry is suggesting. I think we need to move, if we're going to move, rapidly before the interest rates go through the roof, which I think is a good possibility in the next 6 months.
All right. Seeing heads nod, any other last minute thoughts? Okay, very good. Well, listen, a lot of great information, lots for us to chew on. We really appreciate your time. Mr. Townsend, thank you for taking the time and all the leadership you provided with PSPRS. Much needed, and we appreciate you very much. And Mr. Hamill, as always, thanks very much for being here.
Thank you for having us. Mr. Mayor, members of the council, staff, it's been a pleasure.
All right, very good. Then we'll go ahead and move on to our second item for discussion tonight, and that is the departmental accomplishments for fiscal year 2021.
Mr. Mayor, can I, before I turn the floor over to Kirsten, it is 7:48. It went much later than we expected. This is also a long presentation. So if at some point you want us to bring back the other half at the next council meeting or at the next work session, we have enough time in the budget process to extend this out. Even if we skip part of it tonight, if we decide to split tonight's presentation up, depending on how fast it's going, the last slide I would like to make sure we cover tonight, because we're asking for a couple direction points on a couple issues. But with that, I'll turn it over to your finance director.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Yes, it is getting kind of late, so I will try to actually be really quick. I didn't plan on going through every single accomplishment for everyone. So we'll just try to kind of go through this as quickly as possible and still highlight the good points. I just wanted to talk about this year's, oh, I think I have the wrong slideshow, of course. Isn't that how that works? So while I'm getting that up, since I have the wrong one, I just want to mention that the GFOA has changed their criteria on what is presented in our budget document. And part of that change is to have more emphasis on the council's strategic plan. and how our accomplishments and how our goals relate to that plan. And so we are really focusing on that this year in our process and making sure that all goals and accomplishments are matching to the strategic plan that they were part of. So for this year's accomplishments, that would have been your previous strategic plan. And so when I start this, you'll see that we are working with that strategic plan. I'm getting there. Sorry about that. Okay, so this year for the 2020 budget year or 2021 budget document, I want to talk about how we updated our budget document from last year. We just put that up there, our 2020-2021 budget. We really are trying to make it more user-friendly, a lot easier on the eyes, more graphs, more bars, more pictures. We are trying to make this more of a citizen document that they can actually view and want to look at and read. And I wanted to put the link up there so that you guys could go see that it's up on the website right now. So if you want to look at that document. So your 2019 to 2021 strategic plan had 5 main points. You wanted to facilitate economic growth, promote quality of life, maximize efficient water use and reuse, and develop and improve infrastructure and refine the budget process. And then you had smaller little areas that we were to focus on. And we're going to start using symbols to relate those goals and accomplishments back to those strategic plans. So I'm going to start off with council. You know the structure of council and the city. And we just wanted to talk about how one of the main accomplishments this last year was that we really focused on developing and improving infrastructure. And we did some pavement preservation in different areas. We built a couple sidewalks. And this year we're going to be working on, in 2021, we're going to be working on finishing the Willard Street dip and some other things. So it's really been a good year. You worked on adopting a budget that was 1.7% lower than the previous year, and we're going to keep striving to meet those goals. Administration. The administration refined the budget process and completed implementation of the 2019-2021 strategic plan. And then we also started this year in 2021, we created the 2022 to 2024 strategic plan, which will really influence our goals for the upcoming years. So the city clerk's office, she coordinated one town hall meeting in regards to our budget, and that is how she helped in refining our budget process and making sure that we're communicating with our citizens. The finance department. We developed a couple things this year, and one of them is our HEART program. We looked for a program that would help promote employees suggesting cost savings, and I researched other areas and found another program and borrowed their idea and came up with our HEART. And it's just a program where we want you as employees to give us suggestions on how we can do cost savings or any type of strategic plan savings. Human resources. They developed and improved our infrastructure by facilitating the hiring process for over 70 positions, of which 36 were full-time, including a couple difficult to fill positions, which were very long processes of hiring a fire chief, a senior engineer, and a utility engineer. So purchasing did some great things this year. And one of the great things that they did this year is that they contracted with a real estate broker to sell the city-owned property located at 816 North Main. And what does that do? It prepares for our future, and it develops and improves our infrastructure because we're going to set aside those funds to do further capital improvements and or purchase a city hall down the road. IT did quite a few things this year, and one of the big ones that they did is they took the lead in having APS install 4 EV chargers behind City Hall, and those are available to citizens and to anyone coming up. to the area for free of charge. And we've actually received emails of people that were excited after they got to come up here and use those. So economic development, they have really been working this last year with changes in the organization and with creating the destination marketing organization. And they created the new city tourism website with help from their partners. And it's been great. And they've really accomplished that strategic goal. The court. So one of the things that I wanted to highlight on this slide is that we're trying to make our performance measures also meet our accomplishments and our goals and relate to the strategic plan, which is part of what the GFOA is asking for in our new budget, in our new budget document. So you'll see on the right-hand side of the slide that the performance indicators show the symbols that these strategic performance measures meet. So they met or exceeded the Supreme Court standards on consideration, administration, and completion of court cases. And they did that 100% in 2021. And their goal is to do it every year for the future. And you can see how these all connect back to the strategic plan by facilitating economic growth, and they're developing and improving infrastructure, and they're saving funds and refining the budget process by meeting those criteria. So the court this year successfully transitioned their courtroom and did some in-person court and virtual court during the COVID pandemic, which was really a struggle for all of us in trying to make sure that we got all of our processes changed over to be COVID safety protocol. So the legal department. The legal department worked with city management and staff and council and negotiated an agreement with the vineyards and preserve the city's rights and remedies for default, and have an extension of Grosseto Ranch Road to Main Street completed by the end of 2021. I think is that supposed to say? Community development. Community development secured a matching grant it was a $20,000 grant with our $8,000 matching from the Arizona State Historic Preservation Office. And this is for the third phase in the creation of Historic District in Old Town Cottonwood. And they did many other things. They developed quite a few ordinances this year that really help with our growth and our development, and developing, improving our infrastructure, and refining our budget process. Ordinance enforcement. They designed and published a new ordinance enforcement webpage to increase their online presence, which really helps in our communication with our community and our citizens, and also helps in making sure that people are meeting all of our ordinances. Engineering and public works. They completed the design of the First Street sidewalk project, and then they also completed the design for Main Street and the road diet. And then Public Works completed the Riverfront Park Trail and organized a community cleanup event. Building and parks maintenance. They facilitated economic growth by improving the infrastructure of the city with routine maintenance and on city-owned HVAC systems. And they upgraded the street lighting in Old Town to LED bulbs. The police department, they promoted the quality of our life and facilitated economic growth by enhancing physical security with the acquisition and installation of new hydraulically operated mobile surface mounted barriers and portable wall bollards. This was made possible by a grant from the Arizona Department of Homeland Security. So they also promoted cost savings. Communications promoted the quality of life by completing next generation 911 system upgrade to include text to 911 with cell phones, which also helps with the communications with our citizens. The Fire and Medical Department. The Fire and Medical Department this year helped and volunteered at Spectrum to help with the COVID vaccinations. You received an email today that talked about all the man hours that they provided to help make that process a smooth process. And it's a fabulous aid in our community. They also continued their volunteer firefighter program to prepare firefighters for a professional career, which helps our city with improving its infrastructure by keeping its employees. Parks and Recreation and the Youth Center. They upgraded the play structure at Garrison Park to include a new ADA compliant borders, fall protection surfacing, and an expression swing, utilizing the Prop 202 grant funding. And they created and implemented a safe outside program to include instructional videos on how to golf, hike, fish, kayak, and play disc golf during the COVID pandemic. The Recreation Center successfully transitioned to a new recreation software system, which they've also created kiosks so that we can limit the touches at the guest services station and allow people to check themselves in and out of the rec center. So we developed and improved the infrastructure by doing crack sealing in the city parking lots and conducting street sweeping activities along the highway and collector streets. Transit kept running through the whole entire pandemic. We really didn't have any downtime. They promoted quality of life by adding that service, and then they added 2 purpose-built van replacements for ADA transportation, and they received funding, federal funding for the 21-22 fiscal year. The airport, you guys saw the demonstration on the Vera Tower that tracks aeronautical activity and provides a more accurate accounting of aircraft activity and fleet mix, and improved the ability of the airport to acquire more ADA and FAA grants. We also started the master plan, and we'll finish up the airport master plan this year. So the library received an LSTA grant that has provided Wi-Fi hotspots for students at the schools, and that was promotes and helps refine our budget process. And they expanded their online presence with virtual programming by creating a YouTube channel during COVID so that everyone could continue to see and participate in library activities. The Water Department. Water Department completed and refurbished, well, hasn't quite completed yet. They've started the refurbishing of the upgrade to the lift station 4, but they should have that done by the end of the fiscal year. The Wastewater Department has purchased and initiated the installation of three new, oh, that's not the right one. They completed the installation of the SCADA system at 3 additional well sites and submitted the risk and resiliency assessment reports for the 3 largest water systems as required by the EPA. So I kind of ran through that really fast because it's getting late and I know that we all want to be done for the night. And I just want to talk about the upcoming strategic plan. You've seen that beautiful document that Laura created for the fiscal year 2022 and 2023 fiscal year plans. And it's a great plan. And we were going to use these symbols as our lead symbols to kind of go throughout our budget document to show which strategic initiative every item meets. Okay.
Mr. Mayor, if I can pause Kirsten for a minute, if you can go back one slide. That was a lot of information. Usually you get that over about 3 work sessions, at least 1.5. So thank you for speeding through that. It is available. This session is being recorded and is on Facebook Live and those kinds of things. So anybody that has questions can reach out to the city. And of course, we're available to answer questions. But I want to clarify a couple things. Grosseto Ranch Road, we have lots of steps in place to make sure milestones are hit, but completion is probably not till 23. So we got a few years before that actually gets built. Definitely a typo there. Riverfront Trail is scheduled to be done here in the next couple months. So some of those projects that we completed on are expected to be completed before June 30th. This is a budget presentation, and we expect to get them done. If we said completed, it means done by the end of June.
All right, well, that was a lot of information, but council, do we have any questions or comments? Well, thank you, Kirsten. That was a sprint to the end, but we appreciate it very much. And
yes.
And I'm glad to know this is available for folks to watch, or of course it's online, like you said, Ron. You're more than welcome to email us. And to our 3 visitors from the public, thank you so much. I don't have any medals this evening to hand out to you, but you certainly have earned one for sitting through what was a pretty long discussion. But thank you very much.
We do have one more slide that I'm pretty sure Ron wants to discuss.
Great.
Please.
And that's the ideas and the directions for the reserves that we accumulated. We received $1.4 million in CARES Act funds this fiscal year to cover the expenditures for payroll for the public safety. So it's their payroll and their benefits. So because we received those funds, we could set aside $1.4 million in our reserve fund. And we would like some direction on where to budget that money for next year. And so on this slide, you can see we have a couple items and suggestions and ideas that people thought of in the last couple months. A scholarship program for Yavapai College to help with technical training, some business relief grants, housing programs, some facility repairs, a ladder truck, can't leave the fire chief out there. Also replacing pumps at the recreation center, some streets projects. And then another item, we got a request today asking to help contribute some funds towards the vaccination process with Spectrum. So at this time, we just wanted to hear from you how you would like those funds allocated in the future, or what your ideas are, so that we can start planning.
And we can come back with more details if we just kind of want direction. It's sitting there. We didn't know. Reserves is always a great place for that money to sit. I've got no problem with that. And we're just wanted to hear from council as a group.
Council, again, I know it's been a long evening. If this is something you'd rather discuss at a future work session, that's fine with me. If you want to spend just a few minutes kind of going over this list this evening, that'd be great too. Great, good. She wants to plow through, and I'm with her. So is there something that stands out to you, Council, that you think the CARES funding should be used for? Or go ahead, sir.
We've got a lot on our plate here. We just talked about millions of dollars. We've got another project. We're looking at $1 million. And I kind of like the idea of sticking it in the mattress for a moment.
I agree with one caveat. I do think the vaccine request should be a priority.
I would agree with that. I think we should prioritize the vaccines, especially if this is CARES Act money and we're having trouble getting vaccines out to certain people in our community. So anything we can do to help in that regard would be great.
I agree.
I agree with that.
So one question, why is there a ladder truck on here? Do we need a truck or?
No, we do need a ladder truck, and the ladder truck is going to be more than that. So during the budget process, the fire chief and team will present to me the best price they were able to find out there for a truck, and we'll look at some options. But the ladder truck is currently out of service, and it is cost prohibitive to fix. So we've known for many years that it was on its last leg, and it is on its last leg. So This was just an option. This keeps me from having to find another solution, but we'll work through the budget process. We just it's just an option out there for this that I at least had to mention because it will be a $1 million purchase. The other thing that I will bring back in the budget process, since it didn't get anything tonight, is the housing. And so one of the options with the housing is to hire a contract employee to help with the housing solutions, whether it be a housing authority or some other type of solution. We just do not have the expertise on staff, myself, deputy, or otherwise, to really find the right solution. So that we were thinking about possibly contracting out, not a consultant, but hiring a contract person, giving them a year to get it up and running, find a way to finance it on their own to be self-sustaining, and kind of go from there, partnering with Sedona and others. But I can bring that during the budget process through other dollars. But that is probably one of my big priorities, is to figure out how to get the expertise on staff or that we need to help solve these problems.
And I would agree. I think I like the idea of putting the money in a mattress, so to speak, under the mattress, but the spectrum request, I think, is time critical, so I would agree. I think we need to get that.
So we'll bring that back to council probably at the next Tuesday, if we can, Mary Ann, if you're listening, next Tuesday, so that we can get that payment authorized. We just need it voted on, so we'll do that at another council meeting. And I think what I heard Councilmember Naren say was to make sure that we have our ears open to other needs when it comes to the vaccination of the community. So we'll keep that open mind.
All right. And a lot of things on this list don't, in my mind, reflect the need that's come about given the strain and stress that COVID's put on a lot of our citizens. So, but one of the things that the housing program, I think, is well worth looking into. And I like the idea of somehow trying to blend some sort of a scholarship program with business relief. And I don't really know what that looks like, but I think that'd be another thing worth looking into. But for now, the mattress is a good place for it, given all the other uncertainties that we're faced with here. So, all right. Anything else, Council? Okay, then I would motion to adjourn.